All right, welcome to lesson number 2 for week number 2. We've just talked about the 1920s and all of the very many things that are happening during that decade. And we're still in the 1920s a little bit here at the tail end as we explain how we get to the point where we go from this economic boom to this complete crash of the economy that leads to the Great Depression. Make sure that you review your identifications, make note of those here, and then we'll get right started with a guy named Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was our president from 1923 to 1928. The president before him, Harding, he died in office, and so Coolidge was his vice president. He became president in 1923, and then he ran for election in 1924, and he won. Calvin Coolidge, his nickname was Silent Cal. He didn't really interact with the American people very much. He was good at what he did in terms of being a politician, except for that whole communication part of it. But he was a very intelligent man. And as he ran the country from 1923 to 1928, he saw a lot of things that troubled him about the economy. What he would have seen is that although there was this boom of the economy, at the same time we have banks that are failing and mortgages that are being foreclosed upon, which signal that there's a weakness in the economy, that people can't pay their bills, that banks are overspending, that there's a problem that nobody's noticed yet. He would see unequal incomes in the United States, some people making a ton of money and some people making absolutely nothing at all, and not a lot of people in between. He would see agricultural depression. The farmers are struggling to pay their bills. They're struggling to grow enough crops. He'd see things like stagnation of consumer culture. Towards the end of the 1920s, people who have been buying on credit all these new and exciting products, they start to run out even of credit to use, and they're not buying as many things anymore. He would see real estate speculation. People had this fondness for getting rich quick in the 1920s, and they would try to do that through things like real estate speculation, where they would buy up all of this land, for instance, in Florida, land that they had never seen, or not realizing that much of the land in Florida was swampland and that they couldn't actually do anything to develop that land. So a lot of people lost fortunes on real estate speculation. And he also saw that the American people were in denial about all of it. In the 1920s, part of the roaring aspect is that people just believe that things will be good forever. The stock market will always go up, that the economy will always be booming. There's this sense of denial about the reality of economic situations. And so he would see all of these things. And people speculate that that's why he chose not to run for re-election in 1928, even though he was eligible to, because he saw that there was an impending economic disaster that was underneath this idea that everything was going well and always would go well. And so he chooses not to run for re-election in 1928, and it turns out that he was right about the impending crash. One of the things that people always know about the Great Depression is that it began with the stock market crash, and it absolutely did. The stock market crash is a very important part of how we get to the Great Depression. But all of these things that Calvin Coolidge saw are equally as important, because what this indicates is that the economy was not in a healthy state. If you have a healthy economy and your stock market crashes, you can recover from that. If you have an unhealthy economy, as we do in the 1920s, even though people don't realize it, then there is no recovery from a big stock market crash. So there's a lot of other factors, but the stock market crash certainly is the spark that sets everything off. And the stock market contributed to the Great Depression because of overinflation. People were putting a lot of money into the stock market because they believed that it would continue to go up in value and price forever. That's not how the stock market works. It eventually has to correct itself, but people didn't realize that, and they kept buying and buying and buying. And when they couldn't buy it on their own, they would invest through something called leverage. And leverage was when they put in a little bit of their money and then borrowed a lot of money from a stockbroker to make up the rest of what they needed to buy the number of stocks they wanted to buy. That's a very dangerous way to buy stocks, because any dip in the market and you lose your entire investment and you end up owing the stockbroker a lot of money. There was also this thing called a margin call, which was basically a forced sell, that at a certain point the stockbroker could say, I've lost too much money on this deal. I'm forcing you to sell and take your losses now. So leverage and margin calls were two things that made it really difficult to invest the way that people were investing. They were pouring all of this money into it, and then when the market in 1927 through 1929 began to dip like it never had before in the 1920s, people were losing their fortunes, and it was destabilizing the stock market. So all of this comes to a head on Black Tuesday, which is October 29th of 1929, when the stock market crashes for the final time. It's been going up and down, dipping since 1927, causing people a lot of problems, but on October 29th, 1929, it just tanks. And $10 billion in market value disappear within 5 hours. What that means is that everybody's stocks that they're holding on to, all of a sudden they're worthless. And they thought that they had millions of dollars in these stocks that was their money that they could sell and get. And now all of a sudden those stocks, they don't mean anything whatsoever. And so companies and banks and individuals, they all lose money. And it happens over the course of just a few hours. And there is mass panic as a result of this stock market crash. People are running through the streets of New York, down Wall Street, jumping off of buildings. They're horrified at what's happened, and they don't know how to fix it because they don't really understand why it happened. And what this does is it causes a lack of confidence in the economy as a whole. People stop spending money. They stop investing in the stock market. They stop putting their money into banks. Banks had been taking people's money and investing it in the stock market, which is super illegal. But they were doing it, and now when the stock market crashed, banks everywhere began to fail, and people don't trust the banking system. And so they start holding and hoarding all of the money that they have left, and that's the worst possible thing you can do for an economy that needs to recover, because it just halts the economy. Banks begin to fail, which influences the world as a whole because so many people are tied to American banks after World War I. Businesses begin to fail. That causes huge unemployment. And the bottom line is that Americans begin to suffer in intense and extreme ways after the stock market crash. So the stock market crash is the spark that leads to the Great Depression. But it's important to remember that all of those other things that Calvin Coolidge saw were already in existence and creating a weak economy that couldn't recover from this stock market crash. So hundreds of thousands of people are out of work. People are forced to stand in bread lines. They try returning to farming, trying to grow their own food. And a lot of people commit suicide because of their desperation, particularly men who can't provide for their family and are forced to see their children starve. They will commit suicide out of desperation or out of a desire to not be a burden on their family as another mouth to feed. Now, when a crisis like this takes place, one of the first things that people do is they look to the White House. And in the White House, after Calvin Coolidge decided not to run again, we have a man named Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover had really good credentials and the potential to be a really popular president during his time. But this stock market crash and the ensuing Great Depression is going to completely undo his popularity because of his response to the Great Depression. He is a laissez-faire president. He believes that it's not the government's job to interfere in the economy, but the economy has to regulate itself. And so he says that depression is natural in a capitalist economy and that it's just part of it. People just have to deal with it, that tightening their belt and buckling down and working harder will improve their morals and it'll be good for them in the long run, and that if the government offered assistance and tried to buy out businesses or offer money to citizens directly, that it would just weaken the nation and the people. And so they were all just going to have to get through this. And people are really offended by this response because they feel like Hoover just doesn't care, that he's sitting comfortably in the White House with plenty of food to eat, and he doesn't have any sympathy for what the American people are going through. And so they begin to turn on Hoover. Now, it's not that Hoover doesn't care. It's just that he has a laissez-faire mentality, and he believes that the best thing for the country is to handle this in a laissez-faire mentality. So his suggestions are to rely on businesses to volunteer aid and create new jobs. That it's the businesses who are supposed to regulate the economy. And while this might work in theory, it's difficult for businesses at this time to do something like that because so many businesses are also failing and they don't have any spare money to create volunteer aid and jobs. Another one of his tactics was to try to restore confidence in the American system or the American economy by telling people that things were about to get better. This doesn't really work either because people just think that he's even more out of touch because he doesn't realize how bad things still are. And finally, he will try to balance the budget by cutting spending and increasing government revenue, trying to do his part to make the government budget healthy, to influence the economy to be healthy as a whole. So he's not considered to be very successful in any of these tactics, and his popularity will tank immediately as the Depression continues to get worse every year up until 1932. Now, 1932 will bring about a presidential election, and Herbert Hoover is going to run for re-election, but he has really lost a lot of his rapport with the American people, and they're ready for somebody different. They're ready for somebody who's going to bring hope to the American people, and that person is Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who will be elected in 1932 and go on to be one of the most influential American presidents that we have ever had. He is a Roosevelt, part of the Teddy Roosevelt family. So he's born into privilege. He's Teddy Roosevelt's fifth cousin. He will marry a woman named Eleanor, who is also his fifth cousin. He meets her at a family reunion, which is not typically where you go to pick up women, but it worked for them in a certain way. Eleanor accepted his proposal because her mother had always told her that she was ugly and that no man would ever propose to her. And so when one did, she decided to just go for it. And really, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor, they have a marriage practicality. They're good political partners, but there's not really any romance in their relationship. He begins his political career in the Senate and will run for vice president in 1920 on the Democratic ticket, but he will lose that. It's actually a good thing that he loses in 1920 because very shortly afterwards he will contract polio, which is a disease that paralyzes people either from the waist down or the shoulders down. And it paralyzed Franklin Delano Roosevelt from the shoulders down at first. He spent the 1920s working through physical therapy to regain the use of his upper body. And it will be the first time in his privileged life that he really has to struggle for something. And it changes him as a person. It changes him into somebody who believes that there is always a solution and that you should always keep the hope. And so when he re-enters politics in 1929 as governor of New York, he is going to very quickly set himself apart as the perfect presidential candidate in 1932 for the Democratic ticket because he can inspire hope and have new ideas and think of different solutions and ways to restore something that other people would give up on. And so in 1932, he runs on the promise of giving the American people a new deal. Now, there's a lot of components to this New Deal that Roosevelt will enact once he is elected in 1932. And I've listed them out here for you. There's a lot of information in your book about these. We're going to just go over them very quickly for the sake of time. But basically, this New Deal takes place over the first 100 days of FDR's administration, from March 9th to June 16th of 1933. The first thing he's going to do is address the banking disaster. He closes down all the banks for a bank holiday, and then he enacts the Emergency Act that says that a bank cannot reopen until an inspector from the government has gone into that bank and made sure that they are a viable, stable organization. And that helps people to have trust in the banking system again, because they know that if their bank reopens, it's been inspected and considered to be safe for investment, and they will start to put their money back in the banks. He also passes the Glass-Steagall Act, which is basically deposit insurance, that if you put money in your bank and that bank collapses, the government will pay back a certain amount of that money, up to $25,000 at the time. And so that also helps to give people security that they can afford to invest in their bank. And that's going to stop the free fall of the economy. The banks were collapsing. The entire economy in 1932 was about to collapse. And this will stop it from free fall and restabilize the banking economy. He will then go on to pass what we call the alphabet soup of American history: the NRA, the AAA, the CCC, the PWA, and the TVA. The CCC and the PWA are both job creation programs that they're government-funded positions that will hire people to do things like build roads and schools and hospitals, clear trees, create dams, all of these things that need to be done in the country anyway that have been neglected. The government will start paying people to do those things as a way to lower unemployment and improve the country at the same time. The Agricultural Administration Act, the AAA, is going to regulate how much farmers can grow to try to increase the cost of agricultural products. One of the problems is that farmers have been growing so much that these products that they're selling, they're not worth very much. So if they grow less, then the prices will go up and ultimately farmers will be better off. So it regulates, it says farmers can only grow a certain number of crops. The National Recovery Act says that the government is going to be in charge of regulating the economy, pricing, wages, hours worked, how much products cost. All of those things are going to be decided by the government. This is completely the opposite of laissez-faire and really moves the country away from laissez-faire permanently and begins government regulation of the economy. And then the Tennessee Valley Act, this last one here at the bottom, it's going to provide electricity to rural areas that do not have electricity yet so that companies can move in to those areas and begin to provide jobs. So it's a lot of recovery that is being handled by the government in this New Deal, and it's designed to try to fix the Great Depression. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to help. It's going to stop the economy from completely falling apart, but it's not going to put the economy into recovery like FDR had hoped. So there's going to be continued depression throughout the 1930s, and that's going to lead to radicalism. People who begin to get desperate, they're going to look for other options in the 1930s. Men like Huey Long will become very popular demagogues, people who have these large followings, who are considered to be widely known national names, household names. Huey Long from Louisiana will achieve that status through his share our wealth idea, which was the idea to above a certain income, say above $50,000, you tax people at 100%. So everybody can make up to $50,000, but anything over that gets taxed at 100% and given directly to the government to be redistributed amongst people who are making less money, so that everybody is making generally the same amount of money. This obviously doesn't really work. It's not going to be implemented because he's never going to come to power, but people like the idea because they're desperate for some kind of change, something that will provide them with the money that they need to live. And so he gets a lot of support and even ends up running for president in 1936 against FDR, but will be assassinated before he actually can achieve anything in that presidential race. But it's a more communistic idea, and the communist government or the Communist Party is going to grow significantly during the era of the Great Depression because people think that capitalism just isn't working, it's broken. Another radical idea that develops in the 1930s is one that probably doesn't sound all of that radical to you because we now have it. It's called Social Security. But it begins as the Townsend Plan that says that every elderly American would receive $200 a month to try to help supplement money to people who don't have access to any, who are older, who can't work, who are suffering in particular during the Great Depression. These radical ideas, some will be implemented and others, like Huey Long's Share Our Wealth, will not be, but what they do is they demonstrate just how desperate people were at the time. FDR is going to be further undermined by the Supreme Court. In 1935, the Supreme Court will declare that the NRA is unconstitutional, and in 1936, it will declare that the AAA is unconstitutional, both because it's too much government regulation. The NRA basically says the government gets to control the economy as a whole, and the AAA limits how much farmers can grow. And neither of those things are allowing for free trade or independence of employers. And so the Supreme Court undermined the New Deal by overturning those two things, and FDR has to basically go back to the drawing board with what we call the Second New Deal, which begins in 1935. In the Second New Deal, we have the Works Progress Administration, which is more job creation. And then we have the Wagner Act, which is the answer to the NRA being overturned. If FDR says if the government can't control the economy as a whole, then it's going to allow unions to control the economy by allowing unions to become a basic right, meaning that employees could no longer be fired just for being part of a union. And so it allows the unions to advocate on behalf of the workers. It also creates the National Labor Relations Board, which is going to be a government agency that helps to oversee the economy without directly controlling it. And finally, in the Second New Deal, we have the passage of the Social Security Act, which is an adaptation of the Townsend Plan that offers things like unemployment insurance, aid to dependent children, and aid to senior citizens. And so this will be the Second New Deal. Now, it's important to note, A, that your book goes into a lot more detail about these things that will be important for you to look over, and B, neither the First New Deal nor the Second New Deal fixes the economy. Nothing will fix the economy until World War II. War is great at fixing the economy because it stimulates the economy naturally. None of these things naturally stimulate the economy and therefore do not work in terms of restoring or recovering the economy. They only work to provide direct aid to people who are desperate and to help stop the economy from getting even worse. And so FDR does a lot of good, but he doesn't completely fix the situation. That won't happen until World War II, which is where we'll pick up